Okay, let's get things started. I will say good afternoon in the Eastern time and good morning from here from Melbourne, Australia. It is a pleasure for me. I'm Raul Sanchez Uribarri. I'm Associate Professor of Legal Studies here at La Trobe University, and I'm actually very excited today. It's our Charlemos session. I forgot what number was. I mean, I should know by now, but it's enough to say that we've been around for a few years already, and it's become for us a really nice activity to host colleagues across different levels of seniority and expertise. And we have a very special Charlemos today because I'm excited to introduce you to Joséphine Lechartre. Joséphine, I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I have to say my French is very limited. I do read, I can understand, but I can't say much, which I think is a good thing in some circumstances. But it's very nice to have you here. I mean, Josephine is no other but she recently received her PhD. She's at that exciting time of finishing her PhD, getting her book started. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Interamerican Policy and Research, CIPER, at Tulane University, home of excellent postdoctoral fellows over the course of the years. And she went to that great house from another great house. She did her PhD in political science and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame, South Bend. And before she did a BA in Latin American Studies and an MA in International Security from Sciences Po in Paris, France. And Josephine comes to us after receiving the 2025 Gabriel A. Almond Award for her dissertation, Genocide and Cultural Change, Civilian Survival Strategies, and the Reinvention of Political Culture during Guatemala's Mayan genocide. And Josephine, I would have loved to be in there. That means I hope that you went to Vancouver to receive the prize in person.
I did not, unfortunately. I could not.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Well, in that case, this is a double celebration talk. That's what we're going
yes.
to do.
Yes, I unfortunately had another conference, the Conflict Research Society conference in the UK about a week later, and it was a little bit too much traveling, so I had to choose. But thank you so much for
Yeah.
the very generous introduction.
No, you had to pick between two rainy places, so you had to go with one of them. But that's excellent. I'm very happy about that. Your dissertation is fascinating from what I can see, really important for the field as well. I mean, Josephine studied the political participation in the aftermath of genocide. But before we get into her thesis, tell us a little bit about you. Tell us about your interest in Latin American studies and how did Josephine, the scholar of today, come into form? I mean, what was your trajectory before
Mhm.
now?
Sure. Well, thanks for the introduction. Yes, so I've been working in and on the region of Latin America for about 15 years. Originally from France, but I got first introduction to the region as I was an undergraduate at Sciences Po in France. There is a campus that is dedicated to the study of Latin America. It's the campus of Poitiers. And so I had a very formative years studying Latin America there and spent a year living in Brazil as part of a study abroad when I was doing my undergrad. And I think what really brought me to this topic of study was a very important internship that I did during my master's. I had the privilege of working in Colombia for about 6 months in 2016. So that was the month that led up to the signing of a peace agreement between the FARC and the Colombian government. And I was directly involved in some of the talks regarding transitional justice there. So
Right. Hillbilly heist.
Hi, Javier. Uh, I was um, I was working with an organization called the Colombian Commission of Jurists, which is an organization of lawyers who does advocacy on behalf of victims of the armed conflict for the recognition of their rights. And so my task was to help foster victim inclusion within the design of the transitional justice process, and especially the truth-seeking mechanism, the Truth Commission. And I'm telling you this because that was really a moment of aha for me. I thought, this is what I want to do. This is very interesting, tackling the legacies of war, violence, asking the big questions of, how do wars affect societies? And so that's what motivated me to do my PhD at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, because the Kroc Institute also has a very close relationship with peace builders in Colombia, but also in the entire region. And so that's how I got to this topic of long-term legacies of wars. Then I went to work in another country, but that's always been the driving force for me, which is how does violence in the long term affect societies? And what
Yeah,
can we
yeah.
do to address this violence too?
I tell you, fascinating. I mean, and when I read your PhD and when we both had our conversation before Charlemos, because I did have that privilege before hosting you today, I thought to myself, this is a real fascinating trajectory. And by the way, this is coming from an associate dean hat perspective. The importance of international study abroad that year that you guys do at Sciences Po. I'm familiar with that model. It's amazing. They spend 1 year abroad as part of their 3-year degree, if I understand correctly,
Yeah.
and then a 6-month internship. So it's no for us is I think it's a really good model for a Latin American studies scholar to start her work. I mean, it's the right way, right? Organically. And how, but I'm curious about that jump. I mean, you were in the practical side of things, or you were studying, then the practical side of things, come the questions, come the concerns, and then you go, I feel, to a really good place, an excellent workshop to get your ideas going. How was that transition? How did you get your PhD started? How did you come up with the research questions? How do you pin it down? I bet we might have a few PhD students here with us, or
Mhm.
we would love this to be a resource for them as well. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I feel like every time we do this, there is some amount of rationalization exposed, so everything looks neat and nice,
We
but it was
always
a
do.
very messy process, as I think for most people is. Um, I I think the way I started was really, I didn't really have a specific question. I was really interested in this broad topic of understanding post-conflict reconciliation, the long-term legacies of war, but I didn't really have this question pinned down. And this is where coursework was really helpful for me. So I took classes in
Mhm.
peace studies and in political science because I did a joint PhD degree. And so that was really the moment to start fleshing out the ideas in the language of comparative politics and the language of peace studies and post-conflict peace building. And so that was I started thinking about it theoretically, but what was really a turning point for me was actually going to the field. I think that was really the moment where things that were very theoretical on paper and things that potentially made sense started to either become salient or collapse. You have a few ideas in and then you put them to the proof of the field, and some of it don't actually absolutely don't hold, and others do. But that's also part of what's interesting, right? And so when I went to Guatemala for the first time for my dissertation, um, I I had a few ideas about indigenous political mobilization in the aftermath of conflict, but I didn't really know exactly how to phrase that. And that was actually through doing the interviews, doing the archive work, doing all the field work that was really helpful. And then I came back from this first episode of field work, and I did a pre-doctoral fellowship at the University of Montreal during that time.
Mm.
And that really allowed me to start, enjoy this different community and really start fleshing out the final question, which I then brought back to the field a second time to do the second round of fieldwork. So the iterative nature, in a sense of, I have this idea from my practical professional experience before the PhD. Then I take the coursework, I start making these ideas more analytical, theoretically motivated, and then I go in the field, and then things don't work out. But that's in itself is a research puzzle. And then I take them back and I, cook them again, and then I go back to the field. And so I think that's very part of the craft of research that is not necessarily explicit when you read an article or a book. There is an idea that people started from the get-go with this very specific, well-articulated research question, but I think from talking to other colleagues, I think it does happen sometimes, but also many, many other times it's just something that progressively comes to you through field work and engaging with other scholars and engaging with the literature.
Absolutely. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, okay, this is an excellent way to actually break down some of the components of what you of how your research came into form. There and here is fascinating because you're saying, hey, my actual puzzle, the ideas that ended up driving my dissertation, they didn't come from the I mean, the coursework was important, allowed you to start framing those questions, but then it came from fieldwork and the importance of fieldwork. So let's talk a little bit about those two things. I mean, when you talk about those ideas emerging from the coursework, expressing the language of your research and concerns into key concepts, tell us a bit more. And now we're going to shift a bit towards your actual work. Tell us how you became interested in political culture and how you began defining or coming up with these novel ideas or approaches to political culture. And if you like, share a little bit more about what that is.
Of course, yes. So some of these ideas came first through archive work. So I was starting thinking about doing my field work in 2020. So COVID happened that year, and in the case of Guatemala, actually the arrival of COVID was a bit delayed. So from 2020 through 2021, it didn't feel it was either not possible to travel to Guatemala, either leaving the
Mhm.
US or going there, or it didn't feel ethical for me to go to communities that didn't have yet access to the vaccine when I already had access, but could still be a vector of infection. So I had to replace some of that field work with archive work, which I did at two sites. One of them was at the Center for Mesoamerican Research in Antigua, Guatemala. And then I had another round of fieldwork in the archives of the Diocese of San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, in Mexico. And each of these sites has very deep archives about the armed conflict in Guatemala. So that was my very first approach. And when I was skimming through the material, so I was already, I had some ideas of potential field sites, but I wasn't fully sure yet where I wanted to go to do those interviews, do this ethnographic work that I did later. And so as I was revising the materials, I came across very interesting documents that were letters from people who had been forcibly displaced during the conflict to the international community. Some of these documents were actually collected by international agencies like the Dutch Solidarity Committee, for instance. And in other cases, I found communiques by civilians, by the guerrillas that fought during Guatemala's armed conflict. And so that started making me think about not only potential field sites, but also the content of the letters was very interesting to me. So in
Mm.
some cases, the language was clearly a language of class struggle, clearly a more Marxist aligned language coming from communities that were not were communities of civilians, were not necessarily combatant communities. And so I started getting interested in the type of language that was being used, in some cases, the very fleshed out indigenous discourse, but in other cases, more of a class-based discourse. And I started thinking, okay, it looks like there are different expressions of different types of political identities and vocabulary and cultures. And so that's starting that started to give me some idea. And then through these different letters, then I had identified several potential field sites from the communities that had sent those letters. And then the access to do the ethnographic fieldwork became a little bit more contingent because when I arrived then in the field, I sought access because I guess, and we can talk a little bit more about this too, one of the peculiarities of doing research in and with indigenous communities is also respect for traditional forms of organization. And so it's it's a process of securing access, negotiating access, receiving permission to do that type of research. And so it's potentially a little bit more demanding in terms of being able to go to the field site. And so when I say I went through this negotiation process, then I was able to visit the communities. And this is where these ideas became way more concrete, and I started noticing how people talked about their experience during the armed conflict, talked about politics today or not. And the notion of political culture really came from there. So I didn't go in there with necessarily a pre-existing idea of political culture. And this is something that I took from this very organic conversations and interviews, and I thought was an interesting framework to start explaining what I was seeing. Yes, and
And
I
I,
think so. Yes.
and sorry for interrupting you. I mean, because your
Oh, I don't want to
explanation,
go
I
through
didn't want to interrupt you because you
monologue.
were in just this beautiful flow, and you're coming to a really important point and really important contribution in your research, the ethical dimension,
Mhm.
and then the ethical dimension in multiple layers of ethically challenging um, domains within your PhD. On one hand, working with indigenous communities in what is already a precarious conditions in a context of additionally precarious conditions and shifting, which is particularly challenging. Tell us a little bit more about that, and I'm really glad that you brought it up. I have to say, it's one of the aspects of your work that I found most fascinating.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for bringing this up because this is something I care a lot about. And I wanted to be very conscious. And I do think this is also where my peace studies training comes into play because I do think peace study scholars, like anthropologists, have a very acute sense of positionality, or at least try to make that very explicit. And I made that very explicit in my work myself. I am an outsider in so many aspects in this context, and that has implications in terms of how I am perceived, but also how I'm accessing information and how I do research ethically. And so the goal was really to do research with, not on, and so to be able to co-produce some of that knowledge and to think
Mhm.
through also ways of giving back. So the way I approached ethics was multi-layered. So the first thing is that you do have some type of ethics protocols in universities. You do go through this IRB process. So it's called IRB in the US, International Review Board, that gives you some ethical approval. But in the case of indigenous communities, is really not really enough because it's a
Mm.
very individualized process that also sometimes doesn't go very deep into structural conditions or specific populations, such as survivors of mass atrocities. And so in my case, it was first, in terms of the approach towards research, making sure that I was securing access, respecting the traditional leadership structures of those communities. So prior to entering indigenous communities, I actually had a period of discussion with their traditional leadership to explain the project and to request access to the field. And that went through people who brokered these conversations. And once that was okay, then they invited me to come in. Then the second stage was to present to them more specifically the protocol that was going to be followed to do research in their community and request feedback. So they actually saw I filled in a survey, they saw the questionnaire, they knew about the specific types of questions I was going to ask. Um, then sometimes it was also actually a huge help because I was able to also leverage community structures to recruit enumerators for the survey. So that's also
Mm.
something that, we're working together. And also we thought through ways that I would be able to give back in terms of the scholarship I was going to produce. And then in addition to that, then there was also the aspect of obviously securing consent like you would do for any interview in an individualized way. And then obviously also additional precautions about doing trauma-informed research with survivors of violence, which entails, thinking through the ways you ask questions, thinking through the way you react to how people respond to your questions, thinking about your physicality as you engage in the research, etc. So that was a very important aspect of my work that I also think did influence very much the quality of the data that I was able to collect. I do think it is important per se, but it also has positive consequences in terms of then the level of access and reciprocity that you can get in the process.
Absolutely, and again, your experience is very valuable on one hand for research for and with indigenous communities, and also for other groups in different conditions of vulnerability or inequity, and I think that's definitely a model. And when, as you were doing, and if I'm following you, you are joining you in this journey, right? Back in time, you were doing your PhD, you did your field work, you were working with indigenous communities, you had these ideas, and how did that bridge work back from that world of field work into the world of ideas? And
Mhm.
here you have again those two hats you're wearing: peace studies and political science and social sciences more generally, I would say. Um, I would love to hear about how that uh, journey back into the world of ideas happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important question, and this is something that I'm still not fully done grappling with. I'm still very much working with those ideas as I'm thinking about the book project after the dissertation. Um, it's difficult. I feel like there is a tension between being able to tell a parsimonious theoretical story that bridges into debates that are existing in your discipline in academia. And I do feel like the North American system is also particularly interested in very parsimonious theory, where maybe other cultures, and I'm thinking about the French school, for instance, are more into thicker theories and thicker descriptions. And so for me, it was really difficult to think about this tension between a parsimonious theory, but at the same time honoring the stories and the voices and the details of what people have told me. And I think it's particularly difficult when you're thinking about article format publications. For the book, you do have a little bit more space to make that happen. And so I I honestly don't have a magic recipe for this. I went back to think about what did I have in my toolbox when I started fieldwork? What motivated those questions in the first place? What was deconstructed for those questions as I did the fieldwork in how can I close the circle and go back to it? And so to a certain extent, just listening to what people were saying was very important because people themselves were giving me some keys to engage with the literature. So for instance, one of the key standing puzzles that I grapple with in the literature is really, does violence mobilize people or does violence demobilize people? And you have studies that are equally serious that go in both directions. And my answer, my argument is really that the social environment in which violence happens matters because then um, it creates these different political cultures that grapple with violence differently. And that was something that people articulated themselves, and then I had to think theoretically how that would translate from going back to reading, from going back to the literature, from going back to what had been written and where I thought there were some gaps and I could insert myself. So it's it's honestly still an open process for me to make sure that what I'm saying is compelling enough theoretically, but still thick enough to accurately represent what I had experienced in the field.
Absolutely. And I have one last question before going into the questions. And here I'm gonna make an invitation to our attendees to please ask questions. I mean, we have a wonderful guest today, and it's a very exciting conversation. Scott has just shared a question with us, but before we go to Scott's question, privilege of the host, I'll ask you the interdisciplinary work. And we talk a little bit about that. We're coming back home to the world of disciplines. Did you find this challenging working across disciplines, or is it a strength?
So I do think it's both, honestly. I do think it was very useful to approach fieldwork. I was lucky enough to have had a wonderful ethnographic methods class in anthropology during my PhD, which was my main fieldwork training in during the PhD program. Also engaging in all of these conversations with my peers in peace studies from sociology, theology, psychology, I think gave me a much broader approach to the question that I was trying to understand and made me more aware of specific aspects of the fieldwork that maybe did not fit squarely into political science theories, but actually ended up being very valuable sources of insight. But at the same time, I also think this interdisciplinarity is where theorizing becomes difficult because you often want to for professional purposes, present yourself as maybe one person with that strong foot in that one discipline, and it's a little bit harder to sell yourself as this interdisciplinary scholar. You still want people to be able to recognize you within disciplinary bounds. And so I feel like this is where it's very delicate to talk from the political science canon while progressively weaving in theories from other disciplines, other social sciences, the field of peace studies, while keeping this identity of I'm engaging with a topic that has to do with political behavior, with representation, with democratic politics, with legacies of war from this specific perspective. So I do think it's a big strength, but it's a it's a little bit of an equilibrist, game where you have to carefully weave things in so that you remain within the confines of your discipline. That's the way I read it. I do think of myself as a political scientist with this interdisciplinary background. I do think there are very successful, completely interdisciplinary scholars. But I do think when you're trying to talk from a discipline, it's an interesting and complicated process to theorize.
Absolutely. You start grappling with nuance, grappling with ambivalence. We're going to jump now to a question from our colleague here at Charlemos, Scott Morgenstern. I have a question about Josephine's finding research. Your dissertation discusses the different strategies of groups with respect to the state, exit, voice, and loyalty. Why did groups choose one strategy versus another? And this speaks right back to your key contribution, right? Was it related to their experience during the war? And also, please explain a bit more about what the post-war relationships have been between the different groups and the state.
Thanks, Scott. Let me just write this down real quick.
And I use the chance to again prod the audience, hey, ask questions. I already have a question in the docket, but we would love more questions.
So yes, so I have a full dissertation chapter dedicated to this, what I call survival strategy selection. So what I'm arguing is that it was very contingent. So the way the investigation is designed was I was very much thinking in this causal inference logic, and these type of decisions are very important to understand because they set different individuals on different paths. And then if you want to make a causal argument about the effect of their experiences on their posterior political behavior, you do have to account for what happened before. And so what I did is that I selected a case study, which is the case of the municipality of Ixcan in northern Guatemala, which is the municipality that was most hardly hit by the genocide during Guatemala's civil war. And all the groups that I study lived in the same group of cooperatives. These are the cooperatives of Ixcan Grande. And these cooperatives were organized following the same economic and political system. So there was a very egalitarian system of economic production and a very egalitarian system of political representation. So this was a zone of recent colonization in about the 1960s. People came, settled there, created those cooperatives that were administered in this very egalitarian way. And that allows me to not hold constant fully, but to have one similar baseline condition that people were experiencing before the war started. And so what I did then is when these individuals were in these cooperatives and the armed conflict started, so in 1980, 1982 were big massacres in the area of the cooperatives of Ixcan, different people took different paths. What I rationalize as exit, voice, and loyalty. Some of them went into exile, so they exited to Mexico. These are communities that are close to the Mexican border. Some of them exercised what I call voice. They went and aligned with the guerrillas that were also operating in the area. And what I call loyalty, and I take it with a huge grain of salt because I'm not inferring loyalty of the people. This is a strategy that was adopted by people to show loyalty to the state to protect themselves. That doesn't mean they were necessarily themselves convinced of their loyalty. And I'm reworking some of that framework for the book because I understand that it can be a little bit tricky because I'm not necessarily inferring a loyalty from this specific strategy. And so what I'm showing through the different interviews is that I systematically ask people why they made the choices they made. Obviously, this is a limited strategy because people tend to rationalize the decision they made based on their present day situation. So that's to be taken with a grain of salt. But a lot of those reasons were very trivial, if I may say. Many people said, well, it was close to harvesting season and I hadn't harvested yet, and so I wanted to stay to be able to harvest my field. Other people said, well, I was pregnant and so I couldn't run. And others said, well, I was pregnant and so I left. And so I heard many people justify different choices of strategies based on the same motives. And so what I'm talking about in the book is not necessarily that these are random choices, or I'm not using this huge causal language there because there are some elements of motivations that are not fully exogenous and random, but it was a very contingent choice because civilians were left very little time to actually make those decisions. Contrary to other areas, the massacre and the violence in northern Guatemala unfolded in a very short period of time. And the military, which committed most of these exactions, used what is called a scorched earth counterinsurgency strategy, which basically burned to the ground all but 9 villages in the entire area. There were about 150 villages before that. And so that left very little room for civilians to actually start organizing collectively, make decisions as a community. And many individuals actually just had to flee as family units or stay or make those decisions for themselves. And so let me just tell you a little bit quickly about present day outcomes.
Please.
So what I find, or my argument in the book is that then these initial decisions set those civilians in those different pathways, some of them under guerrilla governance, some of them in Mexico in exile, some of them in Guatemala under state control. And that had an effect on the type of political subjectivities, or how I call them political cultures, that developed during the war. And so the outcome I'm interested in is really both the content and the intensity of engagement with the state. And so I'm looking at the political engagement of survivor communities across different dimensions. So I'm looking at protest activity, electoral politics. I'm thinking not only about voting, but also insertion into potentially clientelistic networks, political networks, but also block voting. So using the strength of the community as an electoral vehicle. I can talk more about this as well. I also look at the way they frame their claims. So are they using mostly indigenous identities to make those claims? Are they using indigenous tools like community consultations? Or are they using maybe a more class-based language? Or are they using a different type of political language? Do they participate at all? Because I also find that there are outcomes of no participation. And the last one I'm looking at, which is also kind of specific to this case, but it's the community level participation. Indigenous communities in Guatemala and in other parts of Latin America rely on community labor. So there is some voluntary labor that is provided by communitarians to the community to, for instance, build roads, give maintenance to buildings, etc. And this is a very strong indicator of community strength and also the reciprocity that exists between individuals, and also find that there is some variation in terms of engagement in community chores. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to talk further about this if there are more
Yeah.
questions
No,
that I want
no,
to
well, actually
so.
that last point, and that last point is not going in the direction of my next question, actually. The in what comes next for your research, I imagine that you face the duality, so to speak, of delving further into the case study that you that motivated and gave grounds to your work, and or expanding your framework to other case studies, or again build a bridge, so to speak, to other case studies. And here we're starting to talk a little bit about the book. But I want people to also be curious about your work. Tell us a little bit more about where your work is going and how you're hoping to expand your PhD now.
Well, so I'm working in different directions. So
Okay.
the overarching question is always how does violence affect the political behavior of individuals? And that encompasses their political attitudes, visions, beliefs, and their actual behavior. And so I'm expanding in two main directions. So the first one for the book, I'm thinking about actually going back to Colombia, which was my initial motivation to do this work and integrating some comparative cases there to see how well my theory travels, what we can learn from other cases, and how that potentially introduces scope conditions or verifies some of the mechanisms. And so during my time at the Kroc Institute, I got a grant from the Legacy Project. And the Legacy Project is precisely about leveraging the truth-seeking effort that I was part of before doing my PhD. So it's kind of full circle. I was involved in these conversations about the design of the Truth Commission, and I'm exploiting the data from the Truth Commission to make an argument. And so during this grant at the University of Notre Dame, I did some natural language processing of the testimonies of Colombia's Truth Commission to try to see, using a completely different method, whether I could identify patterns of speech and patterns of expression inside the testimonies of Colombia's Truth Commission that were consistent with the logics of territorial control that I had identified in my work in Guatemala. So that's what I'm doing currently. I'm working on seeing that. There are also some very interesting studies recently that have some survey data that I could potentially use to also test this argument. So I would be interested in incorporating a comparative chapter on Colombia. Maybe another case, but also, uh, to publish maybe publishing the book and then started thinking about potentially other cases. And the other direction I'm interested in actually emerged also from the field is the question of organized crime and the question of the legacies of criminal violence on political behavior, because this is a case of
Mhm.
civil war and internal armed conflict, but Latin America is currently dealing with a scale, the criminal violence at a scale that mirrors in some aspects civil wars. I mean, Mexico is about 200,000 people killed and disappeared in the war on drugs since 2006. That's about the size of that's about the number of people who were killed and disappeared during Guatemala's armed conflict, which lasted 36 years. And so I'm currently working on some projects on Guatemala on Mexico mostly about the actual effects of that. And so we have a project with a colleague. Her name is Regina Bateson at the University of Colorado Boulder, on
Mhm.
how victimization by organized crime, but also experiences with the justice system in response to that actually makes citizens more skeptical of human rights because they feel like human rights are protecting criminals and not them. And this has very important implications in terms of their preferences for um, public security policies like mano dura, iron fist, public safety policies. So this has also very big implications in terms of their attitudes and democratic politics. So these are the two areas where I'm going right now. Yeah.
No, this is fascinating. I mean, we've been not talking for over 40 minutes, and I my understanding is that this was going to be a Charlemos that was a bit shorter than the hour. But I do have a couple of questions that I want to ask you,
Okay.
and please, I continue prodding our colleagues. Any question that you have, please bring it on. Well, and the first the where can we read your work? What is coming out? What is exciting and coming out that would allow us to read your work?
Mhm. Well, so I have a lot of things cooking. Nothing is published just yet. I have a lot of things in the review process. So I have an article that is under revise and resubmit at Civil Wars right now, which talks
Okay.
about different logics of territorial of control during wars. It's expanding the vision. It's cross-national discussion. So it's not specifically focused on Guatemala. And then I have an article specifically about the experience of Guatemalan refugees in Mexico. So the people who were forcibly displaced, the exit part of the strategy,
Yeah,
which is also under review. I hope to have this one out really, really soon. I think that's one of the challenges of doing deep ethnographic research sometimes is that it takes more time to get those
yeah.
results out and also piece them out into article size publications. And then I have some exciting follow-up works with other colleagues. So we have this a very interesting article on a comparative article on Colombia, Guatemala, and Northern Ireland about rebel remobilization post-war. So part of what I saw in my work and what my colleague Jose Gutierrez, who works on Colombia, has seen is that rebels are often deeply embedded in the communities that they fight for through
Mhm.
ties of kinship, family, love, affection, friendship. And so that may lead for renewed community demands for mobilization after peace agreements, as there are renewed needs for security and other things that rebels might provide. And so that can explain also why we can see some remobilization of rebels post-conflict in some cases, but not necessarily in others. So that's a little bit of a tangent that we're taking, but this is also something that's cooking and that we presented in at the Conflict Research Society in the UK just, I think, maybe a month ago or something. So yeah, so I have many things that are at a very advanced stage, and hopefully you can read me really, really soon. Yeah, that's the goal.
Well, th this is fantastic. I mean, I can see there is a book. There is really, really interesting articles. And now my last question, if I may, I'm going to bring you back to the beginning of our conversation. And let's imagine that you meet a few students who are starting their PhDs at the
Mm.
Kroc Institute, and they ask you, Josephine, and I remember when I did my PhD, I looked up to those who were finishing their PhDs or were already in the job market. They say, hey, let's have coffee. Please give me a couple of, advice, tips for doing
Mhm.
a PhD and having a successful, productive journey like the one you've had.
Yeah, well, I think my main advice and really my one and only, and that was also the journey I took myself, is ask the question you really care about. I feel like there is a tendency sometimes, and I also am to blame with that at the beginning of my journey, is to get caught up in the debates that are happening in the field, to think about people are talking about this, where is the gap? Or maybe there is a gap there and I need to go there. What's trending? But the reality is that what is trending now is probably not going to be trending in 5 years when you finish your PhD. So what you should care about, really, and that's my advice, maybe others have a different take, is ask the question that really moves you, because you're going to be stuck with this topic for at least 5 years and even more as you move, through a postdoc, potentially a tenure track, publishing the book. Because, as I said, the theoretical contribution comes later also. You start by something that is exciting and new and that you care about. And then through these different iterations of fieldwork, reading, reworking the research question, then the contribution and the theoretical contribution will come. But I would definitely start by asking something that people really truly care about and then refine it so that it fits within those broader debates rather than potentially the opposite, which can be either a little bit dry or frustrated if you're stuck with a research question that you don't really like for a long time. So that's really my main advice. And the second thing I would say is be curious, be a full human, try to learn from different places, not just academia, not just classes, get interested in different things, because that will open a range of possibilities even for research that is really important. And I find that reading, novels sometimes has actually been really useful for me to think about some of those issues, or writing well. And so I would say just keep an open mind and do the things that you care about. And maybe that sounds corny, but I do really truly believe in that.
Definitely not corny at all. Well, I can tell you on behalf of Charlemos, thank you for a fantastic Charlemos session.
My pleasure.
And we, of course, wish you very well. This is the exciting time of the job market. And I can tell you from our end, anyone who hires you will be very lucky to have you. I think this
Thank
is
you.
a terrific, terrific work, and I'm very, very happy that it has room in our discipline and that Charlemos offered you what we hope is a space precisely to express our own interest, and as you said, chase down those questions and ideas that we really care for. Muchísimas gracias, merci beaucoup, Josephine, and thank you so much. Have a great time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was truly a lovely space. And thanks, Raul, for the amazing moderation and questions as well. I will quote you on you should hire Josephine on my
You should
slide.
hire Josephine. Absolutely. Quote me. Absolutely. Be well. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
And thank you. Gracias, everyone.